Hello and welcome back to Beyond the Pain, Heart, and Home Healing. Last episode was hard for me to get through. I shared my story with you guys with some basics about my upbringing, but then I got into a lot of details about how I found out I was pregnant, all the way up until Layla, my daughter's death. And I guess it does get easier every time I try to tell the story, but it is still really hard. And it was hard to get through last time telling you guys that story. So if you haven't listened to that first episode entitled My Story, I suggest you go back and listen to that one first. It kind of lays the foundation for all the things really that we'll talk about here on this podcast today and everyone moving forward. And it will definitely give you a lot more context for this episode specifically, which is all about how our loss affected my health, but mostly my husband's health too, and all the trauma that came from it, which just made our grieving situation that much harder. So taking off from where I last left off, we had gotten home from the hospital on December 1st after I had delivered Layla, after she was stillborn. And for several months, as you can imagine, we kind of just sat around. You know, my mom basically moved in to help me recover. My sister was around all the time. You know, typically the husband would be the person to take care of the mother who's healing and whatnot, but he was grieving too, just as much as I was. And so, you know, most of the days he could barely keep it together, let alone be there for me, you know. We tried helping each other as much as we possibly could. We tried being strong for each other. But ultimately, I was just so thankful to have the extra help that I did, especially with the kids and running the house and, you know, whatnot. We had so many flowers and meals and gift cards, presents delivered to the house. It was honestly really beautiful to be showered by so many people who literally never even got to meet our little girl. We had a great support system. And, you know, the point of this episode is not really to talk about those early days after I delivered, but I will just mention for those that it can help, there was no rhyme or reason to them for us. And I believe that to be true for everyone who is grieving. We literally sat around and cried. I mean, I was recovering from actually giving birth for several weeks. So I sat around, we watched a lot of TV, we ate a lot of food that people dropped off. And of course, we had to do things like order an urn for her ashes and decided if we wanted to do a service, stuff like that. Like, again, the point is not to talk about the early days, but if I'm going to throw out one piece of advice, like there is no rhyme or reason. There is no right or wrong way to grieve those early days. Just get through it. And if you can make it through one more day, like you did a good job. And I can't remember how long my husband took off of work, but it wasn't very long at all. You know, he was kind of going crazy just sitting around. Like he needed to occupy his mind with something. I was not really like that. I also had the luxury of not having a job that I had to go back to right away. So I was in no rush to get back to normal life. Thankfully, Rick worked from home. So even when he did go back to work, he was still always around, which was really nice. So we did that for several months, and slowly but eventually, you know, my mom wasn't there every day like she was at first. And I would get up and do some stuff around the house little by little. And we didn't go to church for a good chunk of time at the beginning. So I wasn't really seeing people a whole lot. And I personally just kind of buried myself in projects around my home. Once I was all healed up from actually giving birth, like anything I could find to keep myself busy in my home, like I did it. I cleaned, I decluttered, as you guys know, the heck out of my home. I did DIY projects left and right. And of course, I started posting it all on Instagram, you know, and all of these projects, and started gaining a big following. And I remember thinking to myself, like, hey, like, I'm doing okay here, you know, like maybe everything's going to be all right. Maybe I'm not super sad anymore. Like maybe things are looking up. Little did I know, I was simply just coping with my grief, as my grief counselor always described it. And I was just kind of coping with the sadness rather than, you know, actually dealing with it. I was just kind of ignoring it. I was keeping my mind busy and distracted. And about 9 to 10 months after she had died, I just slowly but surely started noticing this heaviness come over myself and my husband. Like, I don't know how else to describe it other than I felt like the adrenaline of what I was focusing on, you know, all those projects in my house and all that, all of the keeping myself busy, like even Rick, my husband, his excitement for me to have a following and this big Instagram audience and all of that, like the adrenaline just started wearing off. And then all of a sudden I realized our grief had not been dealt with. The excitement had gone away, the adrenaline had gone away, and we were just left with our grief, and we didn't deal with it. And because it had just been put on the back burner all that entire time. And I realized this because I reluctantly started seeing a grief counselor. And oh my goodness, it's the best decision I ever made. She calls herself the Grief Gal on Instagram. So if you don't follow her, you absolutely need to right now. My goal is to get her on the show very soon, actually. And I remember her literally describing to me exactly what I was feeling. I remember her saying, the adrenaline is wearing off and your new reality is setting in. And if you've ever experienced an adrenaline rush, like coming down from it is a bizarre thing. It's a super weird feeling. Your body does weird stuff. Like you don't feel like your normal self. And dang, she was dead on with that. And the way that I started reacting to this adrenaline coming down was all of these really random physical symptoms that seemed to be coming out of absolutely nowhere. My heart would race or it would skip beats. I would get aches and pains all over my body. And it would trigger my anxiety to think that literally everything was wrong with me and I was dying, basically. That's what I thought. And rightfully so. I mean, my body was literally, I was living in fight or flight. I was stuck in this mode, just constantly thinking that something was wrong all the time. And which is really fascinating to me. As a side note, that's what the human body does when it senses danger. I feel like I could do an entire podcast just on this topic. I mean, when you are stuck in fight or flight, it is miserable because you are literally always on high alert all of the time. Your sleep is disrupted. You always feel like something is wrong, or something's about to go wrong. You think something is wrong with you all the time, and you basically think that you are dying of every little ailment. Your anxiety is through the roof. Like, it is awful, but it's literally your body's way of protecting itself from danger. It's fascinating. It's terrible to be in it, but it's fascinating now that I'm out of it and I can look back. And it was so bad at one point, I was terrified to get my wisdom teeth pulled out. Like the amount of doctor's appointments I had leading up to this very routine procedure, this very routine dental procedure, just to make sure I was okay enough to have it done. It's honestly a little embarrassing, but it's because my mind was convinced that I was going to die from this procedure. Like, convinced. I was so stuck in fight or flight, I couldn't even comprehend a simple routine procedure like a tooth extraction. I couldn't not see it as life-threatening. And so I went and I got all these tests done on my heart. I literally spent most of my days laying in bed, calling my mom or sister to help try to calm me down. Like, it was awful. I honestly hate revisiting those times because I feel kind of stupid. But let me tell you right now, if you have ever experienced anything like this, you are not stupid, okay? And you can get past this. It's just going to take some work. Okay. Well, I remember when I was deep in it, I was like, I'm never going to get out of this. Like, this is my life from now on. This is how it's going to be. But I promise you can get out of it. It's just going to take some work. And so through a lot of hard work on my own, talking with my counselor, taking very specific supplements, new regimens and lots of other routines and things, my body started slowly to work its way out of that fight or flight. And I finally felt like I could breathe again. It was a very slow process. It wasn't a flip of a switch, but every day I had to remind myself of all of the things I knew to be true. And once I did that for a while, I started feeling a little bit like myself again, slowly but surely. Well, while all of this was going on with me, my incredible husband, who I just thought, like, hey, he's handling this so well. He must think I'm crazy for how my body is responding to this. He was slowly but surely losing a good amount of weight as the months went by. And just a super quick backstory for context. Rick, my husband, was diagnosed with Crohn's disease many years ago, and we ended up having to, he ended up having an emergency surgery because we didn't know that he had it. But it's been mostly manageable over the years. And he was actually in the hospital. It was either June or July after I had delivered Layla. So this was like 6-7 months later for what they had called a Crohn's flare. And he's had those in the past, like a couple. They give him steroids for like 8 weeks. The flare goes away and we move on with our life. So we kind of expected his most recent hospital visit to be the same. But this time they not only diagnosed him with a Crohn's flare, but now they diagnosed him with colitis. And gosh, we were so preoccupied with other things on our mind, like the loss of our daughter and our grief and all of that. We kind of just lumped that into the same category as Crohn's, expected that the steroids would do what they always did and just kind of move on with our lives. But once I started to slowly make my way out of this fight or flight that I was stuck in and came back to my level-headed mind, it dawned on me that Rick was losing a ton of weight. And it wasn't all at once, but over time, it was harder for him to eat without discomfort of any kind. So he would just not eat for a while until he was basically starving. Then Layla's 1-year anniversary came around in November, the anniversary of her birth/death. And that whole month was super hard. And that's when things got really bad for him. He lost like 30 pounds in about 2 months or so, something crazy like that. And I remember him just looking so sick. And I didn't realize it at the time, but when I look back on pictures of him versus now, I can't believe how sick he looked, like that I didn't notice it. He could barely make it through the workday without needing a nap. He was rail thin. He was barely eating. You know, he would come up from work and not feel like doing anything with me or the kids. So he would go right upstairs to rest, and the kids barely ever saw him anymore. He never felt up to doing anything. He was losing interest in his absolute favorite thing, which is sports. And that's like, we knew we needed some serious help at that point. And since we live as holistically as possible, we really didn't want to jump to these crazy medications that they offer Crohn's patients. It's like we knew all of the possible side effects. And our thought was like, why do medicine if there was some natural things that could work? But unfortunately, all the holistic options are really expensive to get educated on, like several thousands of dollars to get really good guidance and methods. And here's one of those moments where I can step back in life and just be so thankful for what I do have in my life, because I have a friend who is literally the best, most loyal friend I've ever had. She raised thousands of dollars from family, friends, probably strangers, just simply sharing on social media, and gave it to us so that we could get Rick on this amazing program that we found that's specifically geared towards people with Crohn's and colitis. And like, we were absolutely blown away. We felt so unworthy that all of this money just came flooding in just to help him get better. And so thankfully he was able to hire a coach with that money, and that coach was able to shed some light on at least getting Rick to be able to eat a little bit more, you know. But unfortunately, Rick had to go back to the hospital right after the new year because the pain was getting super bad again. And so this was just over a year after Layla's 1-year anniversary, to kind of keep the timeline in your head. They had, again, strongly recommended medication. And at that point, in hindsight, we should have started it then. But I personally was terrified of the side effects. And that was my anxiety showing. Like, I didn't think it was that serious of an issue. I wish somebody at the hospital in January when we were there would have told us what was coming if he didn't take the medication. But they really didn't. They simply just kept pushing it without educating us on anything else, really. So they put him back on the steroids like they always did. We continued with Rick's holistic health coaching. And I would say for a few weeks there, things looked somewhat promising. Like, I remember the first day he made it through work without having to take a nap. And I was so excited. I was like, yay, like maybe we're moving in the right direction. You know, maybe things are getting better. But we still felt like things weren't progressing enough. And he still had these pains that were concerning. So we got hooked up with this local GI in the area. And remember how I said, I wish somebody would have told us what would happen if he didn't take a medication for his condition? Yeah, well, she sure did. And let me tell you, she scared the absolute crap out of me. This woman, this GI specialist, I left the office in tears. She basically told us that Rick was going to die if he didn't take these meds. I mean, obviously that was the very short version of what she said, and there's a lot of details in there, but she made enough of an impact that we decided to put it on the table immediately despite all of our fears. And thank God we did, because she was right. We went a few weeks back and forth and, just debating if that's what we wanted to do, and not much improvement in his condition. And he continued to lose weight, and he got down to like 120 pounds or something like that. And he's 6 foot tall. So that is super thin. And like the days were just so long. Like I knew my husband was seriously ill. Like every time he would wake up from a nap, like I would cry tears of joy. Like that's how sick he was. Because I was so scared that maybe one time he just wouldn't wake up. I would ask people at church to pray for him. I would sing over him while he slept. I still to this day say this. I say this phrase over him. I don't do it as much, but I should start doing it again. I would say this: I speak life and health and wholeness over this body in Jesus' name. And like I just spent many nights just laying there in fear, praising God for every morning that he woke up and was okay. Watching him lose all of his drive, having these episodes of intense pain, all while people not really understanding how bad it was. Like this was awful. Like who wants to see their spouse suffer like that, Like I have so much mental trauma simply from those months of watching my husband suffer and waste away right in front of me, all while raising the kids basically on my own and still dealing with my own grief simultaneously and trying to pull myself out of fight or flight, even though at this point it was just getting worse again. Like this was the absolute heaviest time in my life, no questions asked. And I remember going to church one day, and because I had been back to church for a little while at that point, and I literally felt the entire weight of the world on my shoulders. Like anytime anyone even asked me like, how are you? Or even just came up and talked to me, I just started crying. Like I couldn't keep it inside. I was so deep in the trenches, not only with my grief, but now my sick husband. And I literally saw no way out of what I was in. There was no light at the end of this tunnel. And I remember so this was the mother-in-law of the same friend that I mentioned earlier that had raised all that money for us. So her mother-in-law, she prayed over me. And she's a very dynamic woman. She speaks loudly and boldly. And I told her that I felt this dark cloud over my home. And I was so fearful. And I told her how much I had been struggling. And so she prayed over me. And her prayer was so powerful. I will never forget it. Like I said, she's super dynamic and bold. I literally felt this cloud like lift that day. Like it's not that things turned around and, oh, my husband was totally better. Like, no, things weren't back to normal, but I finally felt like I could think clearly again and maybe make some good decisions on my husband's behalf to get him better and move us forward. And so after a lot of research during that couple of months, prayer and very wise counsel from coaches, doctors, all the things, we decided to go ahead and get Rick on this medication, hoping and praying that it would do what it needed to do and not harm him in any other way or cause any major side effects, because that was our biggest fear. Well, that was my biggest fear, at least. So now we're at March 1st. On March 1st, he got his first dose of this medication. And again, I remember just being filled with so much fear that day. I was so fearful. I asked my mom and my sister to come with me because I didn't feel confident going by myself because I wasn't allowed to be with Rick while he was getting it done. It was an infusion. And after all that work I put in, my body had shifted back into constant fight or flight because I was watching my husband suffer like this for so long. And so every time I turned around, something was wrong or something was hurting him. So my body started alerting me again every 5 minutes. And here I was back stuck in fight or flight. Now, I won't get into the tiny medical details here because we'll never really know exactly what happened. But basically, the kind of medication that they prescribe for Crohn's disease is an immune suppressor. Your immune system is what fights off sickness and infection. So when you have a suppressed immune system, you can't fight those things off as easily or even at all without help from other medications. So what I believe happened is that even though the that medication that he took on March 1st ultimately was the right choice, his body was already so sick and infected that this medicine lowered his ability to fight off all of the other things that was going on inside of him. So much so that 2 weeks after his first dose, he was hospitalized again. And this time he was there for a long time for many issues. So during this hospital stay, the details of what happened and why, there's so many of them. Maybe one day I'll do an entire episode just to break all that down, because holy crap, the amount of back and forth that happened in the hospital was insane. This is where a lot of my trauma comes from to this day. I thought I was living in fight or flight before, when Layla died, but nothing compares to literally living in a hospital room next to your suffering husband for 50 days straight. 50, while he's wasting away, not eating, tied to a million tubes, on constant drugs to help with the pain. Strangers are looking after him. You don't know when it's going to end, and you have kids at home who you're trying to be there for, but your husband's life is on the line, so you literally stop all normal life just to be with him by his side. Ultimately, he had great care at the hospital, but I had to carry a lot of the workload. I had to ask so many questions, and I did so much research, and I know way more about the digestive tract than I ever thought I would. I know every single nurse in that wing of our local hospital. Like, I lived at the hospital next to him this entire time. He went for endless amount of tests. He was being fed through a tube in his arm. He had multiple drains coming out of his stomach. Blood transfusions, pain meds. He ended up having major surgery that he ended up tearing during, which caused more drains and tests and tubes and painful sleepless nights. And he ended up needing a colostomy bag after the surgery because the doctors didn't feel comfortable reattaching things because he was so inflamed. And I just remember feeling this strength and focus like no other. Like, deep down, I was so sad. I was so sad and just heartbroken for my husband, and I was torn apart. But on the outside, I was strong, but only because of the support that I had. And like, how anybody gets through any of these kinds of things alone, I will never understand. I only got through those days with support and prayer and worship, basically. And I was so freaking determined for answers and healing for my husband. I spent my quote unquote downtime at the hospital watching videos from his coaching program that Rick had just started a couple months ago. I even scheduled some of my own sessions with his coach so that I could talk to him personally about what I could be helping with, to get us through this time. I grinded every minute during the day, and then I would come home every night and pour myself into bed with tears streaming down my face. And we did this for 50 days straight. My husband did not breathe fresh air one day in the month of April of 2024. He was in that hospital room. I would kiss him every night before I left. Well, the nights that I did leave, some nights I stayed there. But I didn't get a normal hug from my husband for many months because he was so sick. And, even before the hospital, nothing was normal for so long. And when we were nearing the end of our stay, I finally started to see my husband again. His skin wasn't super yellow anymore. Color was starting to come back. He was making jokes here and there again, which, if anybody who knows him, he's the king of sarcasm. He spent a lot of his final moments in the hospital just crying tears of gratitude for so many things. And I will never forget how gentle my husband's spirit was his last 2 days in the hospital. It was a really beautiful thing to see and experience. We had some really good talks about Layla, and we agreed that he was going to be more open about things and honest with his feelings. And it was almost like the surgeon cut out all the bitterness when he was in there, along with 8 inches of his colon. But anyways, so he cut out that bitterness, and It was just a beautiful thing to watch my husband come out of that. And so even though he was finally stable enough to go home after his 50-day stay, with everything that he went through, things weren't quite 100% resolved. So sure, there was no quote unquote emergency anymore, but he certainly wasn't 100% back to himself. So he was good enough to go home, but they did do surgery and they did remove a big part of the main issue while he was there, but there were still some other issues that were causing him some pain. And because he was in the hospital for so long, it pushed off his next dose of meds he started taking right before the hospital. So even after we got home from the hospital for so long, we were back and forth out of there for a few months still with some unresolved issues. And during one of those mini visits at the hospital, we had a Zoom call with Rick's health coach. And he told us a story about one of the sickest Crohn's clients they had ever dealt with. Like, no medication, no protocol was helping this guy. And I won't go into too much detail, but basically the moral of the story was he did all of the physical protocols for the program. He ate what they told him to. He did the supplements. He did all of those things, but nothing was helping him until he started dealing with his inner mental and emotional work. Then once he started healing his heart and his mind, that is when he started to heal physically. And truly to this day, I have no doubt that is exactly what was happening to my husband. I truly believe that, and his initial denial or avoidance of his grief and pain is the reason that he ended up with as many issues as he had. And that is what his health coach said as well. And which is why he and I can look at each other today and every day and prioritize our health, our wellness, and our mental and emotional well-being above everything else with confidence, because we are never going back to that place that we were ever again. And I am happy to say that as of today, my husband is doing super well. He is still on his medication because it truly has helped him tremendously. But we do plan to hopefully wean him off of that in the near future and stick to a strictly holistic approach as long as he responds well to that. He's gained probably around 60 pounds since the hospital and is super mobile again. He eats a ton of delicious and really healthy food, and he is due to get his ostomy reversed right after the new year, actually. And he is counting down the seconds to that day. He's over it. And everything that you heard in my first episode of my story, or things you might just know about me from following me on social media, was the start of my grief and traumatic experience and learning to work through fight or flight. The loss of my daughter was the start of this battle. But this situation of watching my husband basically fight for his life right in front of my eyes, honestly, in some ways has been harder. It has added a whole new layer of trauma to my story. It took it from worse to even more worse. And I didn't think that was possible. But the good news is I have learned that there is life, hope, joy, happiness beyond that deep, deep pain that we both have been experiencing over the last couple of years. And I can look back on all of this that has happened to us, and instead of letting it take us totally down, we can grow from it. We have grown from it. We are becoming the best versions of ourselves now because of it. And so that concludes the first 2 episodes of this podcast, which is basically just laying the foundation for everything I want to share with you, all about, what we've been through and why I can look people in the eye and really relate to them. Like I said last time, there's so much more that we want to share with you, and this is the foundation of it all. So thank you again so much for letting me be real and vulnerable with you. I only share these intimate parts of our lives so that we can hopefully help others like yourself who are maybe going through similar situations or just dealing with loss, pain, trauma, grief of any sort. That is all I have to share with you today. Be sure to watch for my future podcasts. I can't wait to chat with you again very soon. Signing off for now, your hope dealer, Emmy Smaczniak.